is, of course, they don't have a temple any longer, and the reason they don't, so they've reinterpreted things, and they've, in terms of the sacrifices, good deeds. But I'll defer to any Jewish friend here this evening. In terms of these phenomena that he refers to as DDOT, I'm totally open to the possibility that these are literary devices that are put in here. We find this in a number, like Virgil, he mentions many of the same things. But the reason that they would do it with these literary devices is because they're emphasizing what's going on. Like Cicero and many of these mention similar devices with Julius Caesar, but it's emphasizing the death of a great king, and that's why they put them in the text. But there are some historical evidence for several of these, like the eclipse and for the earthquake, and even some of the Quadratus mentions how some of the dead who had come at that time and went into Jerusalem were still alive in his day.
Just to follow up on the embellishments of the Passion narratives, like exactly the sleeping corpses coming up. Now, what happened to them? Did they die again? If they died twice, then there's a contradiction in the New Testament, because Paul says, according to Hebrews, although most people don't believe Paul wrote Hebrews, appointed unto every man is to die once and then judgment. What happened to these corpses? Did they ascend with Jesus as well? But we look at like the Passion narrative here. For example, just really quick in the Gospel of Mark, we are told that when they came to seize Jesus, there was a man there who was in a linen cloth, and he ran away naked from the scene. I don't remember seeing this in the movie The Passion of the Christ. The reason is because if this was shown in the movie, this would have exploded the audience in laughter. You know, can you imagine a tense scene, slow motion, you know, dramatic music, and then you see this guy streaking across the screen? Why don't you stay true to the gospel tradition and present it as it was said in the Gospels? This young man ran away naked. Why are you picking and choosing? What is this, a buffet line?
Thank you, Mr. Mackay. Next question is addressed to Mr. Laguna. You say that Mr. Attai's evidence was biased based on the Quran. However, wasn't your historical evidence biased based on biased historians who believed in the Bible?
That's a great question. I thank you for asking it. I'm doing my doctoral dissertation on the historiography and the resurrection of Jesus, and this is a serious problem that I realize that I have, but so does everybody else in terms of bias. We can't get away from our own bias. When I'm talking about scholars, you know, he said the majority of scholars don't believe the resurrection. Well, he hasn't read the literature. I have read the literature. I've tried to read and familiarize myself with everything written on the resurrection since 1985 in a number of different languages. And in doing that, I can see where scholars stand on this. And I can tell you that the majority of scholars, these are what we would call historical bedrock, these facts that I've presented this evening. Now, many scholars may not agree with the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead, but they agree on these facts. And a lot of times and many of these other scholars, they don't apply solid methodology, and you look at them and you go through these, and this is something which even professional historians admit is a serious problem within the community of professional historians, that they don't have any criteria that they lay out and say, this is what I'm going to follow. They talk about it, but a lot of times they just go off and they just wing it on these things, and they allow their biases to guide them. In fact, the deist historical Jesus scholar, who is named Dale Allison, says that this is a serious problem. And in fact, Michael Grant, who is a professional historian, says it's impossible for anyone to be objective. But here's the thing. In my dissertation, I lay out 6 different speed bumps that a historian has to go over, slow down, in order to keep him from going unchecked in his bias or her bias. And I laid those out, and one of the things is you've got to account for the minimal facts. Another thing is you try your best as possible to detach yourself from bias. So I have, in my investigation, I have looked at these things and done my best to minimize my bias and laid out specific criteria for doing that. So I would like to know from Ali what he has done to minimize his bias.
I have 5 versions of the Bible at home, and I immerse myself in reading Christian literature. That's how I try to unbias myself. Now, you know, when we say, you know, many scholars say this and many scholars, anyone can say many scholars say this and that. That's the trick of Fox News. That's what they say. Well, many people believe this. Who believes that? Many people believe that. Just don't worry about it. Many scholars say this, right? And we've both done that, and it's the word of my scholar against the word of his scholar. Now, what's the claim here? The Christian claim is that the core of the story is the same. There was an empty tomb. Okay, never mind for now the conflicting genealogies of Jesus. Never mind for now only the I am statements found in John. Never mind for now the cleansing of the temple. Was it done 1 or twice? Never mind for now whether Joseph and Mary lived in Bethlehem or Nazareth. You would at least expect the details of the empty tomb discovery to agree. Alas, they don't. the greatest miracle of Christendom, and there's 4 versions of it. What's more, all 4 are believed to be the Word of God, but all 4 cannot be true. If these stories were authenticated and scrutinized with the same standards of the Hadith, they would all be rejected. They don't have a sanad. There's no sound chain of...
Reading 5 translations. I read the Quran too. I don't read it in 5 translations, but I have it in 3 translations at home. I do those kind of things too, but that's not what you do to minimize your bias. And my guess is that when you're reading the Bible, you're just looking for arguments to use against Christians. In terms of most biblical scholars, that they're just supporting my view or they're Christian, that's not the case. If you read the literature, you'd find that the majority of biblical scholars are skeptics. They reject the possibility of miracles. But what they do acknowledge are these facts, and irrespective of how you may account for the empty tomb, I think the empty tomb could be accounted for a rescue. Say Jesus was crucified, God made it appear he was dead, took him, resuscitated him, or healed him in the tomb. But the problem is we can establish historically that the earliest disciples of Jesus, those who he walked with him, sincerely believed that he had died and risen from the dead. And this is the death knell to any kind of theory like that. Nothing destroys an interesting theory that supports your religious views like the facts. Thank you.
Next question will be addressed to Mr. Atai. Having a little trouble reading this, but it says, if Q source was lost, how can you claim that there was no passion story included in it?
Because according to most scholars, again, Matthew and Luke have nothing new to tell us about the passion narrative that they didn't take from Mark. There's nothing new, you see. The Q source document, according to most scholars, is material that Matthew and Luke took that is not in Mark, you see. So that's how we can tell that it's not in the Q source document. There's nothing in Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark. According to most scholars, there's no passion narrative in the Q source document, and that's why it's not anywhere to be found. Where is it? Some people said, well, the Gospel of Thomas could be. Well, it's not a good candidate because it doesn't. There's not enough word-for-word agreements. Where is the Q source document? Where is the hypothetical source document? Where is it buried? Are we going to find it one day? Maybe some Muslim Bedouin, like how he found the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was kicking back with his flock. He's throwing some stones into a cave, and then he hears this jar break, and next thing you know, God knows what happened to this poor Bedouin, and next thing you know, the Israeli government and the Roman Catholic Church, they're the only ones that can see the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was like that for 40 years. For 40, what did they find? Who knows? God knows.
In terms of the Q source, for those of you who aren't familiar with Q, it's a hypothetical source that scholars assign where Matthew and Luke agree with each other almost word for word, but Mark doesn't report it. That's what Q is. And so it seems like Matthew and Luke have a common source there. But that's okay, because Luke even says he got his information from the eyewitnesses. And in that day, there was something called autopsy, a little bit different than what a pathologist might regard as autopsy. But it's looking for eyewitness testimonies. And they would look for that even in written sources. Q is thought maybe even to be an oral source, so it wouldn't be in writing. In terms of a passion narrative, again, it's the teachings of Jesus, but some scholars have gone and saying all these redacted levels of Q, and that's why N.T. Wright, I think, is right when he says these scholars are just building castles in the air, so we need not feel obligated to rent a room.
He mentioned, it was funny, in the Gospel of Luke, he mentioned this, that Luke actually gives his reason why he wrote his Gospel. He admits he's not an eyewitness, that he's going off tradition, and he says, it seemed good to me also. It seems like a good idea for me to do this. Is this constitute divine inspiration? Is this a divine revelation? It seems good because, this is what people are saying, and I can do things better than a bunch of fishermen and tax collectors, so I'm going to go ahead and write an orderly account unto thee, O excellency Theophilus. He's writing a letter to Theophilus, and this constitutes Holy Scripture? Right? So, what was the gospel of the Galatians at the time? Paul opposed the Galatians. He said they believe in another gospel, in another Christ. Where's their gospel? Is it the Q-source document? No one knows. He says there was another gospel in Corinth. Where's that gospel? No one knows. It was only after the Proto-Orthodox won, with the conversion of Constantine, and all these groups were marginalized. Again, there are no Jewish Christian writings on earth that are extant. Where are they? They're lost. They're completely lost. They're buried. Maybe one day we'll find them, and they'll tell a different story.
This will be the last question of the evening to Mr. Lacona. You quote John and other biblical sources in your discussion of the Quran. You didn't mention that historically the Bible has been changed, but